Okay, so apologies. I know these videos are going longer than I meant for them to. The first one was good, only 7 minutes. It's things like this, Greg. Things like this. All right. So, as we continue pushing forward, so we're now going. We talked about memory. We gave a brief overview of the scientific aspect of writing and its key values. Let's talk about how we really do deal with knowledge. First, in any field, the scientific aspect of writing encourages us to be systematic in how we deal with knowledge. This can be frustrating for people who want to see something happen, especially people who tend to be more rhetorically oriented, more socially oriented. It's like we want to see something change. We want to see things done. And sometimes those who have a scientific anchoring to them, they want to make sure that whatever we do is built on some foundation of knowledge that is beneficial. That we know that it's not just do something, it's the something is making sure we have a foundation of knowledge to move from. And so there's this. So there's always a little bit of dialectic tension, this push-pull balancing out. But scientifically, the important thing for a writer to remember is that we need to be systematic in how we deal with knowledge. We need to make sure that when we gather knowledge, that when we do research, it is that we know that the processes at each step along the way are legitimate, are the sources we're getting from are reliable, that by being systematic and working systematically through a challenge or systematically through a set of data or whatever it is, that we are much more likely to have a precision result at the end. And so if we get over-focused, so the scientific value balances out the over-focus on getting something done or doing something. It balances it out with make sure what you do is based on actual knowledge and not just opinion or feeling. And so it's okay to have that in there as part of your mix, and an important part of your mix, especially in cultures and especially in academic writing, but in cultures where knowledge is valued and the development of knowledge is valued. It can be frustrating thinking long-term, thinking timelines that slow down research, especially if you're trying to do scientific work in more of a corporate realm or more of a competitive realm. But the thing that makes science last long term and not do damage is that it's systematic. So that's step one, value one when it comes to working with knowledge as a writer in any field, is we want to be systematic so that we can trust or have a better confidence in the long-term end results. So then we want to think about some broad ways of gathering data or information. How do we discover knowledge? How do we create knowledge? How do we do that first step? This is where there's a lot of back and forth on the approaches. There are big research approaches, and I like show and tell. So we've got things like archival research we might use, which are specific research methods. When we talk about big research methods or approaches in linguistics, research practices in writing. This next book is highly popular, Criswell's Research Design, and I think he's got a new edition out in the last year or two, that sort of thing. We want to be aware of these large-scale approaches. And then within those major approaches, there are fine-tuned research methods that we practice. And so we'll talk about some of those and some of the tensions between different some of the sociocultural tensions between those, because different cultures, different disciplines in college will have a preference for certain research methods. Not everyone, but generally, if you can see it, so you want to be aware. So the individual may not, or an individual may teach a variety of research methods, but the overall culture of a discipline may be geared in a particular direction, and that's important to be aware of. So as we think about it, there are a couple. The first one that kind of comes together is an idea of inductive versus deductive approaches. So when we go and we think about data, Inductive, if it helps you remember, is in the data first. So inductive and deductive have to do with a starting point. What is the starting point of your research? Inductive says my starting point is in the data, and I take from the data my conclusions, and I draw my inferences from the data without any bias as a starting point. I just look straight at the data, only the data. I see what it says. I look for patterns, and then I come to inferences about that data set. Deductive says I may start with a hypothesis, and then I look to see if it fits the facts. And then I throw away that hypothesis, or I confirm that hypothesis based on whether I see proof of that in the data I do have. Sometimes people call this a top-down versus bottom-up, inductive being bottom-up, top-down, deductive being top-down. So the reason that some people have preferences is that, and I know I've heard some people like diatribe, have really strong rants about the problems with inductive. And I've had people very strongly against deductive reasoning or deductive approaches. It's important to note the reasons why. So here are the problems, here are the challenges. If I start in the data and I'm trying to draw generalizable inferences, and my data set is a data set of 4, that's not really a big enough set of data, of points of data, for me to draw something that I could generalize, say, to a population of 20,000. 4 is not a good representative sampling, as the sometimes the language will come through. So if the data set that we start with is too small, inductive reasoning, inductive logic, inductive research approaches may not get us where we need to go because we don't have enough data to say something meaningful or generalizable. We could say what we see and treat it more like a case study, and that's using a specific research approach or research method. But that's some of the challenges people have with inductive. Now, if you're trying to get a sampling of for a representative sampling of 20,000 people, you get 1,000. Some people would consider that reasonable. You get 2,000. Some people would consider that very reasonable. But the size of your data set and whether it's good, whether it's an effective size or an approvable or a socioculturally acceptable sized data set for the question you're asking or what you're trying to figure out in the long run. Again, it comes down to a sociocultural norm. What are your readers going to consider, and what is enough data for you to feel confident in the inferences you're making and the conclusions you're drawing from that data? So that's some of the challenges with inductive. With deductive, with deductive approaches, starting with a research question, starting with a research hypothesis, coming up with some sort of claim that you want to see if it's true, see if it's not, that can be a meaningful way of approaching a situation. The challenges with that are it can incorporate researcher bias because psychologically we know that if we go looking for something, we just might find it simply by looking for it, whether it's there or whether it's sort of there or to what degree it's there. It's kind of the same principle we see sometimes in relationships. It's like, if we believe someone loves us, we're going to look at the loving things they do. If we think someone's mad at us, we're going to read into the actions they have and go, they're just so mad at me. Or if we think someone doesn't respect us, or we think someone doesn't love us, whatever we have as a hypothesis, we will potentially pinpoint data to, sometimes it's called cherry picking, but sometimes we do it unintentionally. Cherry picking is a logical fallacy when we do it often intentionally. When we do it unintentionally, we may pinpoint the data that proves our assertion instead of see what the data reads. So there are challenges with all variety of research approaches. There are weaknesses, there are strengths, and so we want to be aware of which approach to gathering information, gathering and developing a body of knowledge. We want to think about which one's most appropriate. So that becomes a rhetorical question about how do we accomplish the purpose we have effectively through scientific means. And so what is the appropriate research approach? So we've got inductive and deductive. Remember, inductive is in the data. Deductive is from hypothesis down. Sometimes deductive may also be may also be taking someone else's kind of study or someone else's claims or someone else's conclusions and using those as your starting point. That still acts kind of as a form of deductive reasoning where we go and we test something to see if it's true. I feel like there's one other thing I needed to say here. So, if we are thinking about these things, we said they're sociocultural norms. We said we can find inductive reasoning starts in the data, deductive reasoning starts with hypothesis. Sometimes when I think about this as an example, I'll use, I'll use this as an example, a real life example. How do you know what makes a good resume? Most people have had to write them at some point in their lives. Most of the students who come into my class who are first year college or second year college, usually are just in the process or just did this, and we can use either of these processes to figure out what makes for a good resume. This is also a nice way of thinking about like studying genres, of like naming a genre, trying to figure out what its patterns are. So inductively, we might find a pool of or a database of 40, 50, 60, 100, or even just 10. We may look at sample resumes. Start in the data, don't have any conclusions, don't ask anybody, just say, I'm going to sift through 10, 20, 30, 40 resumes, and I'm going to look for patterns. And the things that show up the most, I'm going to say, maybe I should consider, is that what people expect? Is that what the audience expects from a resume, from this genre of writing? So I look and I see, well, a heck of a lot of these resumes are using bullet points. A lot of them are using bolded headings. They're taking visual design or visual design elements for aesthetic and for rhetorical and for technological effect. They're using these visual design things to enhance how the information is taken in. I may even notice that many of these resumes have a statement at the top. One thing that almost all of these resumes have is somebody's name at the top and a phone number or an email address. There were times back if we take the Wayback Machine, Mr. Peabody, there are times when I was working doing hiring, either in construction or when I was working shift manager at McDonald's, when I was doing interviews and stuff, when I would sift through resumes and there would be no contact information. And so the best application, the best resume without some basic stuff wouldn't be there. So the point is, I could just look in the data, look for patterns. That's one way. Now the problem with that is if you've got a lot of people using the same pattern or drawing from the same source, for instance, maybe half of the sample used Microsoft Word's template or used Google Docs template for these things, and maybe there was something that was a little off that employers are no longer using or something like that. So we want to think about context and that sort of thing, or where these sources come from. So we might find a pattern in the data that is meaningful and helpful inductively, or maybe we go to a secondary source. We go see what someone posts on Forbes, how to make a good resume. What someone says about resume. Maybe we ask a family member because they've got credibility. Maybe we know a friend who does the hiring at a particular job, and so we want to get like an inside angle. Like they've seen a lot of resumes, they do hiring. Maybe we consider them more of an expert. So we start with their conclusions, and then we take that, and then we go look at the sample resumes, and then we create our own if we see that. So those are ways of looking at inductive and deductive. I knew I'd remember. And then as we think about this, the thing is, a lot of times these approaches are put against each other, but they often happen in tandem with one being emphasized more than the other. For instance, you can't really have a hypothesis or a deduction without some sort of inductive thing happening, some sort of data to influence you somehow. And so even deductive reasoning has some sort of induction involved. Here's what I mean. If you've ever watched cop shows, a lot of times on cop shows, my wife and I, we love these serials and stuff. And so we'll be watching a show and it's like it's like, how did you know? It's like, my gut told me. It's like, well, what makes what makes your gut right or wrong, or what was it that led you to that? Well, when we think about where our hunches come from or our gut feeling is, it's a form of experiential data gathering that is often subconscious or internalized without us realizing it. Every time we walk up to someone, almost every time we walk up to someone, most of us are trying to gather data that without even realizing it. We're taking in what they're wearing, we're taking in their body language, we're taking in whether their behavior seems erratic or calm. We're honestly, like when we talk, there's research in rhetoric, visual rhetoric, and body studies that says we read their skin color and we draw assumptions based on that and other physical features, for better or worse. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying we have these things that we do. We take in all this inductive data without even realizing it. And so a lot of times deductive hunches, deductive hypotheses are built on experiential knowledge, internalized inductive data gathering. Where we take life experience. So when you've got a detective who's been on the job 10, 20, 30 years in some of these crime shows, and they've got a hunch, what they're really saying, without saying it, is that I've seen 20, 30, 40, 50 suspects like this. I've had training that told me this, and I draw all that together to say this is the guy, right? And so really what they're doing is drawing on experiential knowledge and inductive data gathering over a period of years, maybe possibly not critical inductive data gathering, but we do this on a regular basis when it's how we learn. We just take in information and we process it, sometimes without realizing it, and we come to opinions. So, but what we want to do in academic realms and when we're dealing with knowledge and we're thinking about research approaches is we want to say, why do I believe this? What's the data for that? Where does it come from? And some of the best science, some of the best revolutions in scientific thinking in all disciplines comes because they saw a pattern in something that they couldn't quite put their finger on because they were experientially getting this gut feeling. They were noticing a pattern but didn't know what it mean. And inductively, their brain was trying to put this data together. And then they laid out an experiment, laid out a process for working through systematically a problem they were trying to solve. A lot of times, for instance, when we're given stuff in facts or given like formulas in science, like PV-NRT, PV equals nRT, Boyle's law, that kind of thing. We're given those formulas, but we don't see the tables and tables and tables and tables of data that the mathematicians and scientists had to crunch to figure out that the pattern actually worked, that there was an inverse relationship or a direct correlation between an increase in one and decrease in another, something like that. And so we want to be aware of, even when we're talking big research approaches, we want to be aware of this back and forth that can happen and know that there's experiential knowledge that we can't really prove, but there's something that tells us it's right, even if we're wrong, because we haven't critically thought about it. We have to be careful with that. And then we've got something that we systematically approach to confirm or deny, or to what degree is that gut feeling right. So with that, I've done it again, and I only got to inductive and deductive. So we still have quantitative, qualitative, and a bunch of research methods we can dig into, but let's just pause there. And so thank you for listening. Hopefully you made it all, or watching, hopefully you made it all the way through. I'm sorry that this isn't as interesting and you're just dealing with my body language. But hopefully you got something out of this. Have fun.